Hello and good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that from time to time we talk on different subjects, different topics, and the topic we have chosen today for this discussion is the political thoughts of Karl Marx. So we would be studying on Karl Marx, on his political thoughts in detail, and for detailed analysis, for detailed discussion, we have again with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. So I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, under whose guidance we are going to study on political thoughts of Karl Marx. Hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to have on the political thought of Karl Marx. We have been discussing in our series of political Western political thought, and we have touched upon different political thinkers, both ancient and the modern. In modern period, particularly, you have seen that how political thought in West emerged in context of certain historic and revolutionary changes which were taking place after 16th century, particularly rise of capitalism, industrialism, modernity, and so on and so forth, along with certain philosophical dispositions of that period, enlightenment and Renaissance, and then religious reform movement, and so on and so forth. So we have basically seen that how that context influenced the broad contours of Western political thought in modern times, and all thinkers who are normally studied within the broad rubric called Western political thought try to address some of the concerns which were basically there due to these developments in society, in economy, in polity, in culture, and in other spheres. So therefore, we have to basically contextualize the political thought of the West in the context of the changes in the developments which were taking place, particularly since 16th century. And Karl Marx is no exception. Marx, of course, had the privilege to see certain changes much later compared to what his predecessors like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, or for that matter Hegel, who influenced him considerably, particularly in terms of setting the broad contours of his political thought. In fact, they didn't have this privilege because they preceded him, and therefore one can say that Marx and his collaborator and his great friend Engels, in fact, they were sitting by the side of a highway on which the cart of capitalism was passing by. So therefore, they could see certain changes taking place in the European society much closely, and therefore what normally it is believed that Marx's analysis of capitalism is bang on. Maybe the alternative which is suggested had number of limitations, but nonetheless the critique which he offers, even the critiques of Marx basically acknowledge this fact that those criticisms carry a lot of weight, particularly about the laws of capitalism, particularly the law of capital, the way the market operates, the way capital and commodity, they are the important feature of the capitalist mode of production, and similar other arguments which are available in Marx's writing so far as capitalism is concerned are basically acknowledged by even his critics, that they remain a powerful and perhaps the most important source to understand the working and functioning of capitalist society. So therefore, in fact, Marx's analysis of capitalism is central to his entire writings, because he practically studied capital and the working of capital, and one can say broadly one can say the capitalist system, production process, for 20 long years. Particularly the 3 volumes which he brought out called Capital, in fact, were the product of that analysis. So basically he talked about the different aspects of capitalist social order. He talked of the different aspects of history. He had many arguments about the philosophical, many arguments with philosophical moorings, but nonetheless the most important aspect in Marx's political thought was his analysis of capitalism, particularly the way he put forth in his 3 volumes called Capital, and not only Capital, but many other writings which he produced over the years from particularly in 1840s and 1850s till his death, that is 1883. In fact, those writings are important source to understand the nature of capitalist state, the nature of human beings in capitalist society, the way religion works in these societies, the way culture works in these societies, and so on and so forth. So therefore, basically he was trying to understand capitalism in a more holistic way, trying to approach it from different vantage points, different perspective, but particularly the way he understood the class relations in capitalist society, the class structure, the nature of exploitation, the development of technology, the development of class relations, what he called relations of production, which we will basically discuss later. These things constitute the heart of his theory or heart of his political thought. So therefore, one should keep these things in mind while approaching Marx's political thought. In fact, it is very difficult to touch upon the different dimensions of his political thought in the span of 50 minutes or 60 minutes, but nonetheless we will try to cover as much as possible, particularly the salient aspect of his political thought. Now, but before we proceed further, there are few things which we should keep in our mind, particularly when basically interpreting Marx, because political thought as a whole suffers from this problem, that is problem of interpretation. How do we interpret it? Because normally we approach these thinkers through 2 different ways, either through their own writings and sometimes through the writings of the commentators, those who have studied or those who have researched on them. So in both cases there is a problem, because the problem ultimately lies that is the problem of interpretation of text, that how do you understand the text, simply text as it is available to us, or should we place the text in the context in which that was produced. So that is a different problem, and that problem is of course not confined to Marx, but that problem applies to all political thinkers, and we have basically discussed in context of Hobbes, we have discussed in context of Locke, we have discussed in context of Rousseau, and so was the case with Hegel. But in fact Marx, this problem becomes slightly more important, largely because of broadly the political nature of his project, because one shouldn't forget that the entire project which he conceptualized or envisioned was a political project, a revolutionary project, and therefore normally it is believed that Marx was above all revolutionary. And when we call he was above all a revolutionary, then what is also equally important to remember, that politics was at the heart of his thinking. Normally it is believed that Marx, there is a primacy of economy, there is a primacy of economics. There is basically, because he is referred as economic determinist, because he thought that only economy matters in human life. But one shouldn't forget that that aspect is important, particularly from the point of view of materialism in his political thought. That's why his entire approach is also referred as historical materialist approach, and that materialism of course had to do in context of the broad critiques which he offered to his predecessors who happened to be the idealists like Hegel. So therefore materialism is important, but that materialism doesn't basically diminish this fact that Marx was also giving quite significant place to politics in his project, and politics here should be seen in terms of the revolution which he basically argued, he championed and talked about. So therefore, because of his nature of the political project, the problem of interpretation is more glaring. The problem is more basically more than perhaps any other thinker when we discuss particularly the problem of interpretation. So therefore, the first important thing we should remember, that Marx is a highly misunderstood political thinker both by the critics as well as defenders. It is not that only this misunderstanding is on account of the fact that he has been critiqued extensively by the scholars, but at the same time the defenders of Karl Marx have also tried to interpret him in a manner which suits them, and therefore, that causes lot of misunderstanding. For example, in fact, as it is commonly known in the Marxian studies, that the Marxism of the Second International, which is basically remembered for the kind of economic determinism which it propagated, and therefore, many people feel that many Marxian scholars, Marxist scholars who have studied Marx, they feel that it is nothing but vulgarization of Marxism. Now, apart from this economic determinism of Second International, the way the political parties, because as I mentioned that it is a political project, in fact the political parties calling themselves the legatee of this Marxian ideology, and most of them are basically known as the communist parties in different countries. The way they have looked at this entire discourse, that is also highly economistic, or one can say deterministic. So therefore, they may be posing themselves as defenders of the Marxian thought, or maybe defender of this legacy, but nonetheless the way they have interpreted it, many scholars who have closely studied Marx's political thought, they believe that they are basically far away from the kind of argument which is available in his writings. Now, the next problem is that Marxism at times acts as a legitimizing ideology for many countries who call themselves socialist countries. For example, the erstwhile Soviet Union, or for example, today China. And for example, China even today refers itself to be a socialist country, and when it calls itself a communist country or socialist country, of course, there is a distinction between socialism and communism. If the time permits, we will basically come back to this issue, but nonetheless, when it calls itself a country which believes in the ideas and ideologies championed by Marx, Lenin and Mao, then one feels that the China is also trying to basically distort the entire position, at least the philosophical, theoretical, ideological position espoused and championed by Marx. So therefore, Marxism when becomes a legitimizing ideology, and therefore his political thought is used for this purpose, then of course this also creates some misunderstanding. And it is normally believed that after seeing such misinterpretations and such distortions during his own lifetime, Marx at a point of time, he said that if this is Marxism, then I am not Marxist. For example, he tried to distance himself from the vulgar interpretation of his ideas, but after his death, this vulgarization of political thought has been quite rampant. Now, the next important thing which we should also remember is basically this kind of scholasticism which has invaded the Marxian political discourse, because as I mentioned in the beginning that he was above all a revolutionary, and when you call him a revolutionary, then basically he was basically a thinker who stood for change, not for status quoism, and that is why this is what normally we refer as a left politics, because left stands for change. Now, if he stood for change, then of course the simplicity in language, and because that simplicity in language and simplicity in the writings are important for politics and the political project, particularly as a guide for politics. But what has happened that over the years, the kind of scholasticism, or basically this phenomenon in social science called the jargon-laced writings, they have also invaded the Marxian studies, and therefore sometimes it appears that this is not basically geared toward this political project, but rather this is something which is meant to cater to the needs of the fashion of the day. So therefore, this scholasticism is another problem which perhaps is something which we have to encounter when we study the Marxian political thought, particularly the commentaries, the writings on Marx. And then of course, there is another important aspect, that on the one hand you have a flourishing Marxism, on the other hand a diminishing revolution, because of course if one understands him as essentially a revolutionary thinker who championed the cause of revolution, then what we find in today's world, on the one hand the interest in Marxism has grown phenomenally, and it has flourished like anything, but on the other hand this politics of revolution has diminished. And even if many groups, many parties, many political associations, they talk of this revolutionary politics, but perhaps in fact the way they do their politics is far removed from the kind of liberative politics which he championed and envisioned. So, these are some of the problems which we have to basically encounter when studying Marxist political thought, particularly in context of his revolutionary orientation and his revolutionary politics, which normally we do not encounter in context of other political thinkers who preceded him or who succeeded him. So, therefore, as a preliminary remark, I think this is quite important to remember. Now, when we talk of this Marx as a revolutionary, then of course, this primacy of politics is important, and this is another issue for debate and controversy, because many people would not agree with this point of view that politics is central to Marxian project. They still argue that the Marx has a historical law of change, and therefore the kind of historicism, particularly one important philosopher who has studied and commented on Marx, Karl Popper, he basically alleges that Marx's political thought is basically inflicted with this historical determinism, and the kind of determinism he finds in Plato, Hegel and many other thinkers who preceded him, the same sort of determinism he thought that was there in Marx also, because there were iron law of history, and therefore man was captive in this history. There was no freedom, there was no discourse on freedom, and because those laws were basically inviolable, and therefore one had to simply abide by those laws. So, therefore, it is normally believed that there was no space for human action or human activity, and politics essentially stands for human activity and human action, and therefore, whether it is Popper or for that matter many such critiques, they simply dismiss this point of view that there is any politics in Marx, because they believe that what is basically happening is determined by the law of history, and one does not have much choice but simply to go along with it. So, therefore, this is one line of argument, but another line of argument is that no, politics is quite central to the Marxian project, and because this revolution which he championed, that revolution is nothing but human action, and that human action in politics, of course, the kind of politics which Marx talked of was different from the liberal perspective of politics, where politics is basically meant to reconcile the conflicting interests. But in Marxian framework, the politics has a different agenda altogether, because the conflicts cannot be reconciled through the mediation of political institutions or political process or through human agencies, because conflicts are so structural in nature that those conflicts can only be basically resolved if the basic cause of that conflict is addressed, and that basic cause is basically a structural cause, and that is basically the class conflict. And how that class conflict originates, that is perhaps very important to understand within the Marxian framework, because class conflicts of course are basically the important feature of human history, and therefore in the Communist Manifesto Marx wrote that history of all hitherto existing society is history of class struggle, and this struggle has resulted either into the revolutionary reconstruction of society or the mutual ruin of the contending classes. So, therefore, either or the possibilities, and therefore, even from this paragraph one can infer that there was no kind of determinism which is normally attributed to Karl Marx, because he was saying either or, either the revolutionary reconstruction of society or the mutual ruin of the contending classes. The two possibilities are there, but of course as a result of the class struggle, and class struggle is basically the fact which we have to see in our history. Now, one thing is important, that history is very important for Marx, but the way he approached history was different, because his entire approach to history was materialist interpretation of history, and therefore if we understand Marxian political thought as a whole, then there are few important aspects which basically stand out as the pillars of his political thinking. One is the dialectical materialist approach, dialectical materialism as a method, and another is this historical materialism as an approach. So, therefore, this dialectical materialism and historical materialism are two important basically the pillar of his political thinking, apart from dialectical materialism and historical materialism as method and approach, there are certain other things which are important to remember when studying Marx's political thought. They are basically the historical materialism, the kind of materialist interpretation of history which he offers basically leads one to a more deeper analysis that how history has evolved, and therefore one here finds a significant difference from the interpretation of history or the approach towards history in his predecessors and in Marx. Because for example, Hegel, his predecessor, who influenced Karl Marx more than perhaps any other thinker of the earlier generation, in Hegel also the history has important place in his political thought. But in Hegel's hand, the history had an idealist interpretation. He looked at history as moving due to the force of ideas, not force of matter. It is basically the absolute idea which was the motor force of history. But unlike Hegel in Marx, it is not idea which basically causes this change in history, but it is the matter. And therefore, this materialist interpretation comes into existence in his political thought, different from Hegel and many others, idealists of the earlier generations. So, this materialist interpretation is significant. He gives utmost importance to the forces of nature, basically the matter, and therefore, this matter is the cause of change. The change is not from outside, but change is innate in this phenomenon, in nature, in society, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, how does it happen? And that basically takes him to the broad analysis of history, and that basically he doesn't look at history as ancient, medieval or modern as normally it is done in social science, but rather he looks at history or the division in history in terms of primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and then of course socialism and communism as a result of human sponsored or human made revolution. Of course, these changes are always revolutionary. For example, the transition from feudalism to capitalism was also revolutionary. The transition from capitalism to socialism would also be revolutionary, but this revolutionary would be basically a kind of conscious attempt on the part of human beings to liberate and emancipate themselves. So, therefore, this revolution will be different. Now, of course, those were also influenced by the same factors, same material factors which would influence the subsequent changes in history, because all human actions have been influenced by the material factors. And because of this argument, normally it is argued that Marx made human beings subservient to the material forces. Human beings had no space for action. It was the matter which determined his human action. For example, whatever human beings do in history are determined by law of history. They are determined by certain forces in economy, in society, which are basically outside him or basically beyond their control. And it was largely on account of this fact that a philosopher like Popper dismissed and demolished his political thought. But of course, Popper had his own problem. For example, when he talked of Marx, he talked of Marx in the same breath as he talked of Plato and Hegel, without mentioning the differences between Plato, Hegel and Marx on account of certain other factors. Of course, there one can find a lot of similarities as well, but then there were differences also. The kind of determinism which can be applied to Hegel, or kind of determinism which can be applied to Plato, perhaps may not be applicable to Marx to some extent in some cases. So, therefore, that is also one important thing to remember. But in fact, this historical materialism is important, which constitutes of few factors which we will discuss in course of our lecture. For example, the way he looked at this evolution of human history from this primitive communism to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, and then of course socialism and communism. But apart from this, there is another important aspect in this entire argument, and that is basically the class structure and class struggle, that how classes come into existence and how those classes ultimately lead to the existence of these classes ultimately lead to class struggle, and how that struggle becomes so important for the movement of society. and then how that class struggle becomes the main causal force of historical change. So, therefore, this class class struggle or the class analysis is quite significant here. Now, apart from this class, there is another aspect which is also equally important, and that is basically the revolution, that how this class struggle is seen as a revolutionary struggle, that how the differentiation or the distinction or the conflict between the propertied and the propertyless, the haves and have-nots, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the feudal lords and the serfs, this type of division of society between the haves and have-nots are basically have been there from the very beginning in different society, changing according to the epochal considerations. But the thing is that these changes, these conflicts have revolutionary implications, and those conflicts are largely determined by certain factors, and those factors are basically conflict between the forces of production and relations of production, and these forces of production and relations of production together constitute what Marx calls mode of production, and that mode of production is basically the basic structure of society on which stands the entire edifice, the political edifice or the cultural edifice, what he calls superstructure. So, this base superstructure distinction in Karl Marx is quite significant. So, therefore, mode of production comprising of relations of production and forces of production, and relations of production is relation between human being and human being, that human and human, that is between the two persons involved in production process is the relations of production, and forces of production implies the relationship between human being and nature, because when one acts on nature, because the entire production is basically caused due to this relationship between human beings and nature. And now this relationship is referred as the forces of production. So, forces of production and relations of production, they together constitute a mode of production, and mode of production is very important tool to understand any society, any economy, any history in the Marxian framework. So, this mode of production is the basic structure, what we call infrastructure, Infrabau in the German. So, this infrastructure, the basic structure, is basically central to this entire structure called the social system or social formation. Now, this social formation within the Marxian framework therefore comprises of two different structures. The basically this basic structure, and which is often referred as base, and the superstructure, and that superstructure consists of the state, the political institutions, in fact religion, the culture of people, and every other sphere of human life becomes part of this superstructure, which is standing on this basic structure, the base. And this base superstructure relationship has been a matter of great controversy within Karl Marx. What is the relationship? How the relationship has to be understood? Of course, those who try to offer interpretation based on the original writings of Karl Marx, they feel that there are a lot of mediations between base and superstructure. The relationship between base and superstructure is not mechanical as normally it is perceived and understood. Basically, there are mediations, umpteen number of mediations, and those mediations are valuable for understanding this politics. But as I was referring earlier, the defenders of Marx have been responsible for giving this impression that the relationship between base and superstructure is mechanical relationship. What happens in base will automatically travel to the superstructure. Superstructure does not have any autonomy. It is determined by the base. What happens in base will ultimately lead to basically changes in the superstructure. So, if for changes also it is important in the base. Later on, of course, there were many developments within the Marxian theory. For example, even the practitioners of Marxism like Mao Zedong in China, when he talked of cultural revolution in China, he tried to give importance to this culture, which is part of the superstructural sphere of society within the Marxian framework. But he believed that the changes in the base, that is a change in mode of production, in the economic relationship, in the class structure, may not lead to changes in the superstructure automatically. Those changes have to be planned, those changes have to be designed, and those changes have to be fought for. So, therefore, the one revolution which can bring changes in economy may not be enough to herald changes in other spheres of society, and those changes have also to be planned and executed in the same way as the changes in the economic structure is done within the Marxian framework. Even later we have seen the great amount of debate taking place on the issue of the relative autonomy of state. If we get the time, we will come back to this issue, particularly the debate which is basically now referred as debate between Miliband and the Polonjars, the two scholars who studied Marxian political thought quite closely, particularly on the issue of the autonomy of the state, that how much state enjoys autonomy from the classes, because the classes constitute the part of the base and the state constitute the part of the superstructure. So, whether the state is only the managing committee of the bourgeoisie, as Marx referred in his Communist Manifesto, or the state also has some amount of autonomy, and if that autonomy is there, then what type of autonomy is available to the state? Because sometimes it is believed that Marx himself, in his very important writing, which is case of writing of a different genre, that is 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, when he talked of the autonomy of the Bonapartist state, many people believe that Marx talked of this relative autonomy of a state. And this clue, taking clue from this writing, subsequent Marxist scholars like Polonjars and others have built on this argument, saying that a state is a managing committee of the bourgeoisie. In other words, one can say this instrumentalist view of the state is just one point of view, one perspective within Marxian thought. But there is another perspective also, that relative autonomy of the state, that a state on certain occasions, in certain situations, historic conditions, enjoys relative autonomy. How, in what context relative autonomy is enjoyed, there are a number of factors for that. We will basically refer to later when we will come to the discussion of a state. So, therefore, this base superstructure relationship and this autonomy, that how much is autonomy the superstructure enjoys vis-a-vis a state, has been a matter of great controversy and debate. And here the contribution of one German philosopher, a Marxist philosopher, Althusser, is quite significant, because Althusser, whose writings were mostly produced in 60s, late 50s and 60s, in fact, Althusser was arguing against two different types of thinking or two different types of writings. One was existentialist writing, particularly identified with Sartre and others, and therefore he emphasized this structural aspect in Marxian political thought. And another thing was that he was also arguing against this kind of economic determinism, which was quite fashionable those days, as I mentioned in the beginning, as the tradition or the legacy of the Marxism of the Second International. So, Althusser, therefore, what he did, he tried to accord important place to politics in the Marxian project. And when he came to this relationship between base and superstructure, of course, through his argument of overdetermination, that what ultimately happened will be overdetermined, and there is no one mechanical causal relationship between base and superstructure, but there are different structures, and those structures have autonomy within the broadly the given framework of this economic structure. Therefore, what will happen will be overdetermined. That overdetermination means that this totality will be expressive totality, expressing different contradictions of the different spheres, not only one contradiction manifesting mechanically in another, like the economy manifesting itself in every other sphere. So, therefore, this expressive totality, as as Althusser mentioned, and when he talked of this overdeterminism, that was a significant contribution from the point of view of Marxian political thought in terms of the interpretation, particularly this autonomy of base and superstructure and the autonomy of politics. So, these things are important to remember. Now, apart from that, there is one more issue which shouldn't be lost sight of, that is the Marxism is an unfinished project, because Marx, as he himself said at number of places, that the coming generation will put us right. Therefore, he basically acknowledged this fact that whatever he was writing was not a finality of truth. There was a space and there was scope for basically criticism, there was scope for evolution, because evolution was an important aspect in his political thinking, and that is why normally it is believed that Marx was influenced by the 19th century scientificism, or the kind of development which was taking place in science, particularly in 19th century. And one important person, one scientist who influenced him was Darwin, his theory of evolution. So therefore, he is first, one important, he is the first person, one can say, in the Western tradition who acknowledged the limitation of his political thought, and he said that the coming generation would put us right, would be far numerous. So therefore, he also realized that what he was writing, what he was arguing was not final. In fact, there would be there will be a scope for correction, there will be spaces for evolution. So therefore, this unfinished project is quite significant to remember, because Marx's entire understanding is, as I mentioned, was influenced to great extent by the political ideas of Hegel. And when Hegel said that truth is the whole, in fact this totality, that truth is the whole, basically conveys a very significant philosophical truth, that what is truth is basically whole, and one cannot understand the whole unless one cannot understand the whole, one perhaps cannot say something which will be approximate to truth. And understanding this whole is not a very easy job. So therefore, this holistic perspective is quite significant. Now, this holism in Marx, of course, is also targeted by some critics like Popper and others, but that is not possible to discuss here. What I am trying to say, that this truth as a whole, a Hegelian dictum which he basically borrowed, in fact tells you that how he looked at this social and economic phenomena, how he looked at the society, how he looked at the economy. Now, what happens, that this appearance and reality dichotomy is also important in Marx, the way it was important in Hegel. So therefore, this Hegelian influence basically influenced him, and not only influenced him, but basically put him in a situation where he understood the limitation of his understanding, limitation of his political project, or if not limitation of the political project, but the limitation of human capability. And therefore, he is perhaps one person who acknowledged the limitation of all human endeavors. So this is also one important thing to remember. The next important thing to remember is the status of his writings, that all writings of Karl Marx are of not the same stature, the same same genre. For example, some writings are in form of the manuscripts. They were not meant to be published. Some writings were for self clarification, not for the public consumption. Some of the writings didn't have the same status as perhaps the Capital, the finished project, but nonetheless, because of his caliber as a political thinker, those writings also had lot of insights. So therefore, when it came in public domain, people now have considered them a very powerful source or very powerful thought, and therefore they are also used for understanding Marxian political thought. But at times they creates confusion also, because then that creates contradictions. For example, what we encounter is a kind of distinction which is made between early Marx and the late Marx. Now, early Marx, who produced a book called Economic and Philosophic Manuscript, 1844, where he talks of theory, where he gives the theory of alienation, where he has a human nature, theory of human nature, and that Marx, of course, is different from the Marx of Capital. So, for example, someone like Althusser would argue that there was epistemological rupture in Karl Marx between the early and the later writings, or early or the later Marx, because early Marx was basically Hegelian Marx, the later Marx was a more materialist Marx, and therefore the later Marx, according to Althusserian interpretation, is more in tune with his political project than the early Marx. But nonetheless, in fact, there are writings at different periods of his evolution of his political thought. They are different in terms of emphasis, they are different in terms of orientation, they are different in terms of influences. For example, what happens in the early writings, particularly which was available much later, which was published much later, that is economic and philosophical manuscripts. It was in form of a manuscript that is basically available to us now as a book. Now, in this he talks of the alienation of man, that how human beings' relationship with nature is a complex process. Man humanizes nature, because man and nature relationship, human beings nature relationship is a very important aspect in Marxian political thought. And as I mentioned, that this entire discussion of the mode of production is basically based on this relationship between human being and nature, that is the forces of production. And the relations of production, that is the in production process, when people get involved and they basically leads to that relationship, is contingent on, rather this relationship between human being and nature is contingent on that relationship between human being and human being within the production process. But this relationship between human being and nature is very significant. And what he says in his early writings, that economic and philosophic manuscript, that man humanizes nature, that is man interaction with nature leads to a kind of humanization, human impact on nature. But what happens subsequently, and as a result of this interaction, that man gets dehumanized, then nature reacts, and that reaction leads to dehumanization. So therefore, this relationship is a dialectical relationship in Marx, and this is quite significant today, because he was talking in 1840s, 1844 this book was, these manuscripts were written. Now he was talking that there is a limit beyond which nature couldn't be exploited. There is a limit beyond which nature could not be used for material needs, to fulfill material needs, and therefore the nature might react. Now what is happening today all over the world, when we are talking about ecological balance, when we are talking about the nature reacting in form of many natural disasters, when we are talking of sustainable development, we are basically recognizing or acknowledging or accepting the fact that there is a limitation of human exploitation or human invasion or human being conquering nature. Because with science and technology, human beings were drunk with science and technology, and they thought that endlessly they could conquer nature. But one started conquering nature, but the nature has also started reacting. So therefore, this argument in Marx was very powerful, because he was the only European thinker at that time, apart from certain romanticists, romantic thinkers who talked of this aspect of human society. Marx was perhaps the most important Western political thinker who talked of this limitation of this relationship between human being and nature, and that led him to talk about fourfold alienation of man or human beings in society, that how human being is alienated from his own labor, from his own product, from nature, and from his fellow beings. So therefore, what happens that this alienation, theory of alienation, basically gets founded on basis of these manuscripts. Not only that, even the criticism which was there earlier, that there is no discussion of human nature, there is no human being in Marx. Basically, Marx only talks of history, the laws of history, the material forces, the matter, so on and so forth. There is no discussion of human beings. Now, this criticism was also taken care of by discovery or by the publication of these manuscripts, because there is a powerful theory of human nature in Marx, particularly in this writing, that is economic and philosophic manuscript. He says that while critiquing Bentham, he says that what distinguishes the worst of architect from the best of a bee, that man raises structures in imagination and creates it into reality. In other words, he said that pre-conscious activity is human species character. So what is human nature? This answer is given by him by saying that pre-conscious activity is human species character. But then this character does remain the same, as normally was argued by many liberal political thinkers. He said that this nature gets modified in each historical epoch according to the socio-economic changes, according to the basic structure of the society, according to the material conditions of that society. And therefore, he said that within capitalist society, the nature of human beings is determined by the capitalist mode of production. Therefore, while talking of Bentham's, he said that Bentham's man is a Bentham's notion of man is a British shopkeeper's version of man. So therefore, he said that they took one particular man or man of a particular historical epoch and believed that this is perhaps forever, because they have been always like this and they would always remain like this. And Marx differed with that. He said that there is a general human nature, and that nature gets distorted within capitalism, that gets modified in other historical epoch. And therefore, the purpose, his idealism, in fact one can see in terms of his utopia, that utopia was how to retrieve that human nature with his pristine purity. What was that? Human nature in general, that is basically pre-conscious activity, and therefore in his utopia, that is basically his imaginary or basically the future society which he envisioned, that is the communist society, where the theory of justice would be that each according to his ability, each according to his need, unlike socialism where he said that there will be each according to ability, each will have according to ability, and each according to the contribution he or she will make, that is work. Unlike this work principle, the need principle which will prevail in communist society. Now in that society, the kind of life which human beings will lead, he also gave enough indications, and he said that I will hunt in the morning, fish in the evening, and compose poems at dinner time without ever becoming a hunter, a fisherman, and a poet. That is the kind of division of labor which characterizes this society will completely disappear, and human beings will lead a more total life, a human life, where this pre-conscious activity which is human species character will come back to it. So therefore, this was integrated with other writings in terms of the imagination of a future exploitationless, free, emancipated society. But nonetheless, what is important here, that in this writing, that is the philosophic, economic and philosophic manuscript, EPM, on the one hand raises many gives space for many criticisms, early Marx, late Marx, Hegelian Marx and non-Hegelian Marx. On the other hand, it also answers some of the queries which were there earlier, that there is no discussion of human nature in Marx. So therefore, this is also important, that is a status of his writings, that where to place and how to place his different writings within the broad framework of his political thought. Now, one thing is also important, the historical context is important, because he was writing in 19th century, as I mentioned. In fact, of course, this faith in science was perhaps quite rampant. This faith in science was perhaps the dominant creed of the period, and therefore he was also drunk with science like other contemporaries and his predecessors. Now, of course, what happens, because this historical context did not have only this dimension of science, but there was another context that was highly influenced by the developments in economy, in society, and different spheres of life, particularly in Europe. So therefore, some amount of Eurocentrism one can find in Marx's writings, the way we find in other political thinkers, and this is becoming quite important, particularly from the point of view of India, because when today we study Indian political thought, we try to look at Indian political thinking from this point of view, that how the Indian society is seen through the European lens, and how this society can also be understood and analyzed from the Indian lens. And therefore, some of the Indian political thinkers also become quite important for us. For example, the Gandhi. Now, what happens that in case of Marx, that this Eurocentrism comes in form of the broad approach he adopted toward non-European societies. For example, when he made this statement that the industrialized countries show their future to the less developed countries, now he basically talked of a law, the law of evolution, that this is how the evolution has taken place. What has happened in Europe will also happen in other parts of the world. Now, in fact, on India, he of course had access to secondary writings, but nonetheless he produced some important writings, and one of the important writing which he produced when he wrote for New York Daily Tribunes in 1850s, particularly around the time when India was having that 1857 rebellion. Now, what happened that where he future of British rule in India, the writings are known as Marx's writings on India or future of British rule in India, and he talked of both progressive and regressive role of British rule in India. And regressive role, of course, he said that is known to everyone that it is leading to plunder, it is leading to exploitation and so on and so forth. But the progressive role, he believed that Indian society is basically a kind of a stagnation which it is witnessing will be particularly eroded only with the help of this colonialism, because colonialism for the first time is making changes which are going to break the backbone of this stagnation, that is the caste system. And here he identified the Indian railway system, that Indian railway system now would not allow the kind of practices which are basically endemic to this caste system to prevail, and therefore it will break this caste system, and that is perhaps the backbone of this stagnation, and thereby herald the new changes, and therefore it is going to be source for revolutionary change, and therefore it is playing a progressive role. Now, apart from that, when he came to non-European societies, he basically abandoned his usual mode of analysis, that is basically the division of human history in terms of primitive communism, feudalism, capitalism, socialism and so on and so forth, and referred to all these, particularly the Asian countries, as characterized by Asiatic mode of production, where there is no class struggle, there is no class divisions, and the appropriation of surplus is basically taken, appropriation of surplus is done by the state, which is basically sitting at the top, and at the bottom you have the basically autonomous village republics. Now, this kind of relationship led him to argue that these societies have an Asiatic mode of production, where mode of production is significantly different from the European countries, and therefore, in fact, these societies have a powerful superstructure compared to the base, that is economic structure, because the superstructure, that is a state, is so powerful that it is the appropriator of surplus. Instead of a dominant class, which is basically the important law of history according to his argument or his analysis, here it is something different. The state is the main appropriator of surplus, because state is basically, in absence of classes, it is a state which is the filler, it is filling this gap. Now, what happens therefore, many people believe that he abandoned his entire framework when he came to non-European countries like India, now through this Asiatic mode of production. Now, of course, subsequently many debates have taken place among historians on the transition, and they have basically tried, and interestingly most of them have been from the Marxian ideological disposition or persuasion, and they have argued that Marx's writings were based on secondary sources and evidences, and therefore that is not borne out by the facts or borne out by history. Rather, India also had a transition from feudalism and from the earlier epoch to feudalism, that is called the feudal society. India also went in direction of feudalism, and many historians have basically worked on this. Similarly, on issue of Asiatic mode of production, people critique him, saying that this reflects his Eurocentrism, that he was looking at the Asian societies like India through the European lens. So, therefore, this allegation, this charge of Eurocentrism is there, and sometimes it is also validated by some of his arguments, as I mentioned, that industrialized countries show the future to the less developed countries, which is basically the Marx's own statement. So, therefore, this historical context is important, the evolution of science in that period, the kind of the scientific discourse which was taking place, the kind of historicism which was there, the way the Western world was being looked as an ideal type within the, by using this Weberian phraseology, one can say that ideal type, and then entire thing was being constructed. So, Marx was perhaps, when he talked of Asiatic mode of production, he also turned the entire Western experience into ideal type and tried to look at the non-European societies from the point of view of that ideal type. So, these are some of the issues which we encounter when we come to Karl Marx. But nonetheless, as I mentioned, that in spite of these limitations, he was ahead of his time in terms of acknowledging the limitation of human enterprise, in terms of basically understanding the limitation of science, particularly when he talked of humanizing nature but also dehumanization of man in economic and philosophic manuscript, particularly his theory of alienation. And then at the same time, the scientific skepticism, which we find in Karl Marx, was also equally important. That was not quite common those days, that when he said that dot everything, you critique everything. Rather, his famous statement, the ruthless criticism of everything that exists, ruthless in the two senses, that it should not shrink from its own conclusion, and it should not hesitate to fight the powers that be. This is very important statement from the point of view of 19th century Europe, because at that time this scientific skepticism was not quite common, which normally we find in the writings of Karl Marx. So therefore, or for example, as I mentioned earlier, when he said that the future generations would put us right, which would be far numerous. Therefore, he acknowledged the limitation of his own political thought, the limitation of human enterprise, and also acknowledged the evolutionary process both in society and human mind. So therefore, these are some of the important things which we find him, that for him there was no final statement of truth. Rather, in fact, in communism, even he believed that communism was the beginning of human society, emancipated society. So this way one can say that these are the important aspects we should remember while discussing Marx. But when we come to the core issues in Marxian political thought, in fact, it is dialectical materialism, historical materialism, the discussion of class analysis, and the discussion of state, which we will address in our next lecture.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much. Today we had a brainstorming session, I would say, Karl Marx, which we have studied a lot in our books, but I believe that this lecture would be very beneficial for the students who might be watching us or would be watching with the help of YouTube. Very soon we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube, with the help of which you can see this lecture, you can attain more and more knowledge the number of times you wanted. And dear friends, if you want to give your feedback regarding this particular lecture, or if you have any queries, then you can mail us at info.cc@nic.in. So we would be meeting again very soon and would be continuing our series further. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.